Hi, welcome to AMC at the Movies. I'm Jon Spurney, and today we're going to be talking about the business of Hollywood. If you're watching this, obviously you're somebody who loves movies or is interested in movies. And I think, cinema still remains, to my mind, the most transporting and enveloping form of entertainment really ever created. And, when we're sitting in a dark theater or even just on our living room couch, a great film can make us completely lose ourselves in a way that other art forms cannot. And these incredible experiences are obviously dependent upon the talents of the people who create them, the actors, writers, and technicians that physically create these stories that so enthrall us. But those people themselves are, of course, dependent on the financial backing that is provided by the business entities that actually pay for the production and distribution of these films that we all love so much. So last time we talked about the importance of technology in the creation of the golden age of Hollywood, about how cinema is an art form reliant on machines. And we saw how the development of new technologies spurred greater success in Hollywood movie making. But as much as American cinema is based on technology, it's just as much based on business, the financial machinations of cinema production. And changes in the way that business is done have had a sizable effect on American movies throughout the history of American cinema, and especially during Hollywood's golden age, which is, of course, the period we're interested in here. So let me start by saying that in 1937, so peak Hollywood golden age, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was then the president of the United States, made a salary of $75,000 a year. But at the same time, Louis B. Mayer, the founder and head of MGM Pictures, made a salary of $1,300,000 a year. Mayer was the highest paid man in America. And he was the first person in American history to make $1 million salary, which in 1937 is the equivalent of over $20 million today. So Hollywood was obviously incredibly successful and producing enormous wealth for not just for Louis B. Mayer, but for a lot of people. So how did Hollywood produce this incredible wealth, especially during the depths of the Great Depression, when the economy of the United States was at its lowest ebb? Well, I think it's important to remember during this time, and we've talked about this earlier, that before the invention of television, movies were the only form of visual entertainment available to most people. So during the 1930s and the 1940s, the average American went to the movies 3 or more times a week. And just to put things into perspective, today, the average American goes to a theater to see a movie about 2 or 3 times a year. So things have really changed. There are still 5 major movie studios, and these days, each studio produces 8 to 10 movies a year. But in the golden age of Hollywood, there were also 5 major studios, and each one of those studios made 50 movies a year, basically put out a movie every week. There were 5 new movies in the theater every week. And that large output obviously allowed for large financial return and large profits, generated a lot of income. But the only way the studios were capable of creating this much content, and I mean, it's kind of mind-boggling, to make a movie every week is incredible. And the only way the studios were capable of creating this much content was to industrialize the making of cinema, to apply the process of mass production to the creation of mass entertainment. By the 1920s, the mass production of consumer goods was very common in America. And thanks to the advent of the assembly line, which was used most famously by Henry Ford to mass produce his Model T automobile in Detroit, Michigan. And the heads of the 5 major studios, and during the golden era, that was Paramount, Fox, MGM, Universal, and RKO. They followed this mass production template, and the methodology they used to do that, we now call the studio system. So what was the studio system? And by the way, though most of the studios I just mentioned still exist in name, the studio system does not exist anymore for reasons we will discuss later. So the studio system was an attempt to industrialize the creation and distribution of motion pictures. And they did this with great efficiency using a process called vertical integration. So what is vertical integration? Vertical integration is a system in which the supply chain that a company is dependent on is owned by the company itself. So basically, the producer owns all of the means of production. So a modern example of vertical integration would be your iPhone. When the iPhone was first introduced, it ran on CPU chips made by Samsung, obviously a different company than Apple. But now Apple produces their own chips, which allows them to save money and increase the power of their products by controlling both the design of the phone and the design of the chip that powers the phone. That's vertical integration. So similarly, the studio system used vertical integration to control all of the components necessary for the creation of a motion picture. So each studio owned a huge lot. This is the Metro Goldwyn Mayer, the MGM lot in the 20s. Each studio owned a huge lot with numerous sound stages in which to shoot their films. Each studio kept all of their creative personnel under long-term contracts, controlling which studios and films they could work on or for. And each studio even controlled the exhibition of their films. And this is something that I never knew about because when I was a kid, it had already stopped existing. So I didn't know about this till I was an adult. But during the golden age of Hollywood, you could only see a certain studio's film in a theater that was owned by that studio. There were not independent movie theaters like there are now, which show multiple movies made by multiple studios. And so we shall see that this particular practice was one of the main factors that led to the ultimate collapse of the studio system. So during the classic Hollywood era, the vertical integration of the studio system allowed for the mass production of movies, just like an assembly line would allow for the mass production of automobiles or refrigerators or whatever consumer good. So during the studio era, a staff of writers working under contract only for a particular studio would produce a script. Actors who were under contract to that studio would be selected for each role in that script. A staff director, under contract to that studio would be chosen to direct the script. The film would be shot on the studio's own sound stages and backlot. The film would be edited by a staff editor, scored by a staff composer, and the film would even be developed in labs that the studio owned, creating the final prints to be exhibited. And when those prints were ready to be exhibited, they would only be screened in theaters like the ones we're looking at now, owned by the studio in question. And at the completion of each film's production, each one of these people would simply be assigned to the next film in the pipeline. And this allowed each studio to produce 50 films a year and enjoy the incredible profits that they enjoyed. And so it's interesting, we now think of the director of a movie being the ultimate creative force behind a picture. And this is primarily due to something called the auteur theory, which was promulgated by French critics in the 1950s, which we'll hopefully address in a future discussion. But during the heyday of the studio system, it was often the producer of a film who really had the most creative power, because they were the ones who chose which of the studio employees would be used for each stage of production. And they were the ones who would shepherd each film through these stages of production. So Hollywood's classic era, during that time, there were superstar producers who became known kind of the way directors are known now for their style of production. So, for example, David O. Selznick produced epics like Gone with the Wind. And this is the famous burning of Atlanta sequence from that film. And Selznick, it was Selznick who brought famed director Alfred Hitchcock from England to America. And the first picture they made together, Rebecca, in 1940, won Best Picture. So he made a good bet there. Arthur Freed headed what was known as the Freed Unit at MGM. And he was responsible for some of the greatest musicals ever made, including Singing in the Rain, which you're looking at here, The Wizard of Oz, and Meet Me in St. Louis. These incredibly beautiful, colorful, huge musicals were all overseen by Arthur Freed. And Hal B. Willis oversaw countless classic Warner Brothers pictures, including Casablanca, which we're seeing now, The Maltese Falcon, and Key Largo. That's just three of them. All three of those star Humphrey Bogart, and they're all great, and you should see all of them. Nowadays, the five major studios are essentially identical, right, in terms of content they produce. All five are owned by much larger conglomerates that are beholden to shareholders. And so each studio is unlikely to take any creative risk, hence endless repetitions of superhero films. And the films these companies distribute are actually often produced by independent companies rather than by the studios themselves. So there's virtually no discernible difference today between, say, a picture made by Universal or a picture made by Paramount. But during Hollywood's golden age, because of the prevalence of the studio system, which again was a business proposition, an economic system, but because of that system and the closed nature of that system within each studio, each one of the five majors really had a distinct reputation, a brand for making a certain kind of movie, even though all the studios were producing multiple genres of films at any given time. But particular studios were really known for being especially good at particular types of pictures. So MGM was the most high class of the majors, and it was known primarily for its lavish musicals. This is An American in Paris, an incredibly beautiful movie, also overseen, of course, by Freed, the Freed Unit. And, on the other hand, Warner Brothers was the scrappy, unsophisticated studio, and it was known for its gritty gangster movies and crime movies like Scarface, which you're looking at here, and The Public Enemy. And here comes a car crash. Very exciting. And during the classic era, Universal was famous for its now iconic horror movies. Pictures like Dracula and Frankenstein and The Mummy. These were all made at Universal. I love this shot through the mill. It's great. And Universal was the home of that genre. If people went to see a Universal horror movie, they knew it was going to be good. So the studio system made this brand recognition possible because each studio had its own particular crew of professionals at its disposal, and its own particular backlot and sound stages, and its own particular production process. So there really was a difference between studios that, with the demise of the studio system, no longer exists. So if the studio system was such an efficient business and it created so much popular content, what brought about its demise? And of course, it's lawyers. Two major legal decisions in the 1940s caused the Hollywood studios to radically alter the way they did business. So the first of these two was a lawsuit brought by actress Olivia de Havilland, challenging the practice studios had of holding actors under contract and not allowing them to work outside of the particular studio that they were contracted to. So de Havilland was one of the most successful actresses of Hollywood's golden age. And she's perhaps best remembered, I think, for her performance as Melanie Hamilton in Gone with the Wind in 1939. But she was in a lot of pictures, and she won the Oscar for Best Actress twice. And Joan Fontaine, who was another big movie star of Hollywood's golden era, was actually her sister. But they famously hated each other. That's kind of an interesting backstage story. So we saw that a fundamental principle of the studio system was keeping talent like Olivia de Havilland under contract and thus under control. So Olivia de Havilland had signed the standard studio contract for actors, which forced her to work exclusively for Warner Brothers for 7 years. But when that 7-year period was fulfilled in 1943, she asked to be released from her contract so she could work at other studios. But Warner Brothers had suspended her occasionally when she had refused a role. Basically, the studios would punish actors if they didn't want to do the parts they were assigned. And so Warner Brothers had suspended her for the times she had refused a role. And Warner Brothers argued that these periods of suspension, which in de Havilland's case, by Warner Brothers calculation, amounted to 6 months, had to be added to the original 7-year term of her contract. And she didn't agree with that. She sued the studio and she won. And so the result was a law in California, still known as the de Havilland Law, which stipulates that no one can be held under contract for a period of more than 7 years. And this law is still used by entertainers to this day to get out of onerous contracts, not just actors, also musicians and other people. So the de Havilland Law, this decision, conferred greater creative freedom to performers and drastically reduced the studio's power over their contract employees. So that's the first legal change. The second legal decision that led to the collapse of the studio system was the so-called Paramount Decree of 1948. So as we saw earlier, part of the vertical integration of the studio system was the ownership of theaters by the studios making the movies that were shown there. So you could, for instance, only see a Paramount picture in a theater that was owned either partially or entirely by Paramount Pictures. And on top of that, the studios instituted a practice known as block booking, whereby the few independent theaters that existed were forced to purchase multiple films at a time from a single studio. So that way the studio could force independent theaters to show kind of cheaper B pictures in order to get the A pictures that audiences actually wanted to see. So the studio would sort of say, oh, you know, we have this great picture full of movie stars that everybody's going to buy tickets for. But if you want that, you also have to book these 3 other pictures that people aren't going to be so interested in. So in 1938, all of the studios, all 5, were sued by the United States Department of Justice for illegal trade practices under what's known in America as the Sherman Antitrust Act. Because the studios owning the theaters constituted an oligopoly, which is an illegal market where prices are dictated by a small number of sellers. The studios, of course, fought the suit, and it went to the Supreme Court, but they ultimately lost. And in 1948, the Supreme Court, in the Paramount Decree, what is now known as the Paramount Decree, the Supreme Court ruled that film production companies could not own film distribution companies. And interestingly, the Paramount Decree, has existed all this time, but it was actually terminated very recently in 2020 because the studios successfully argued that it was no longer relevant in a world where the vast majority of filmed entertainment is watched not in a theater, but in people's homes via streaming services. So there's no oligopoly anymore because theaters aren't that important in the business. But back in 1948, the original decision, especially when you combine it with the de Havilland decision, radically altered the way that Hollywood movies were produced and exhibited. And of course, the final nail in the coffin for the studio system was the advent of television in the 1950s. With the invention of TV, films were no longer the only source of visual entertainment people had, and people could easily watch movies and shows in the comfort of their own living rooms, as we do today. And so when TV started to gain popularity, the studios needed some way to convince people to leave their homes and go to a movie theater. So in what I think is one of the most dramatic examples of how the business of movies affected the way movies were made and their content, the studios tried to develop new technologies to make the film going experience more spectacular in order to lure viewers away from their TVs. And so the main way they did this in the 1950s, and we've talked about this earlier, was by altering the aspect ratio of their films. So what is aspect ratio? Aspect ratio is the aspect ratio of a film is the ratio of its width to its height. And we usually express it as two numbers separated by a colon. So initially in the silent era, films were shot with an aspect ratio of 4:3, basically a square. And this was just an arbitrary standard that Edison decided on, when in the early days of films. That clip is from The Great Train Robbery from 1906. So this is very, very early days. But with the invention of sound, the way sound works is an optical soundtrack is printed next to the image and read by the projector, which keeps the image and the sound synchronized. And so with the advent of sound, a portion of this image, the 4:3 image, had to be given over to that optical soundtrack. So that resulted in less of a square and more of a rectangle that was just slightly wider than it was high. So this aspect ratio, which is expressed as 1.375 to 1, became known as the Academy ratio because it was standardized by the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, which is the same organization that gives out the Academy Awards. The Academy ratio was the standard ratio for all Hollywood films during American cinema's golden age. And this is a clip from the great Double Indemnity. That's Fred McMurray. Double Indemnity, made by Billy Wilder in 1944. Really awesome film noir that I highly recommend. But so when television came along, the studios needed to develop larger screen formats with a wider aspect ratio, widescreen, which hopefully would create a much more spectacular image than the small, square, black and white images in the early TVs that people had in their homes at that time. So this is from Ben-Hur, 1959, William Wyler, the incredibly famous chariot race sequence. And you can see how much wider the image is. And, this was a big deal. Like every movie theater had to change the size of their screens. And not just that, well, let me just say this, that they were fighting against TV. And incidentally, when the aspect ratio of TVs, when they were designing the first TVs and standardizing the aspect ratio of TVs, they chose the Academy ratio because the vast majority of filmed material they were going to broadcast had been shot in that ratio in the first place. They knew they were going to be showing old movies, and so they used the old ratio of movies. And so the studios retaliated by creating this new widescreen ratio that was much more spectacular. But not only did theaters have to build new screens, this desire for a wider image created a problem shooting the films, because films were all still shot on the same 35 millimeter film in the same, square 35 millimeter cameras. These cameras recorded a square image, not a rectangle. So each studio created its own solution to this problem using various techniques. Some ran the film through the camera horizontally rather than vertically. Some used special lenses, the anamorphic process that distorted the image onto the film, and then you had to have a special lens on the projector that undistorted it when you projected it and made it wide. And these widescreen techniques all had famously trademarked names, which we see often in movies of the 1950s. So things like VistaVision and CinemaScope and Panavision. And many of these techniques are still used today. In fact, last year's Academy Award nominated film, The Brutalist, was shot in VistaVision, which is a 1950s process. This was the first film shot in VistaVision in like 25 years. And you can see that it's a wider image. It's not a square, it's a rectangle. And American auteur Paul Thomas Anderson, who I'm a big fan of, he has a new film coming out in September that was also shot in VistaVision. So, these formats still remain. And, when you see movies now, they're most likely widescreen. Although, because movies are now made and projected digitally, a director can really choose whatever aspect ratio they want because it's all just manipulated by a computer. So a filmmaker like Wes Anderson will alternate aspect ratios within a single film. So if you've seen The Grand Budapest Hotel, that movie is sort of a story within a story within a story. And each story is shot with a different aspect ratio to kind of give you a clue as to which time period you're in. And that's something Wes Anderson does in his movies a lot now. He just uses whatever aspect ratio he feels like for whatever shot. But these widescreen formats were not enough to save the studio system. And it basically had ceased to exist by the 1960s. And ironically, the widescreen TVs that we now all have in our homes allow us to watch a film in whatever aspect ratio it was originally shot in at home. And that's why they chose the aspect ratio of a widescreen TV is 16:9. And that was literally chosen so that any Hollywood format could be shown on the same screen. Which is what happens. So our next discussion is going to take place on Tuesday, 19 August at 20 hours MSK, and we'll be talking about censorship in Hollywood. And before the invention of the rating system in 1968, Hollywood tried to self-police itself and control the content that could be shown, and also tried to control the political ideas that could be expressed in films. And that obviously had a great effect on the films of Hollywood's golden era. So we'll be talking about that on 19 August, and I hope you will join us then. So I would love to take some questions. And Tatiana asks, are musicals still popular for production in Hollywood? That's a great question. And, I just watched literally Sunday night, I rewatched La La Land, which I think is a fantastic musical and owes a great debt to the Arthur Freed musicals of the MGM musicals. And just speaking of aspect ratio, that film begins with a big frame that says filmed in CinemaScope, which was MGM's widescreen format of the 1950s. So Damien Chazelle, who directed that movie, is obviously very conscious of all of the things we've been discussing. La La Land was a very successful film and was, of course, nominated for Best Picture. And there was that incredibly dramatic thing where it was mistakenly given the Best Picture Oscar before someone realized they had made a mistake, and Moonlight actually won. But the problem is that musicals are hard to market, I think, especially for men, younger men who are kind of the main market for Hollywood now. And so it's incredible to me when I see previews for films that I know are musicals. Hollywood now, they will not show people singing in the preview. They basically don't want people to know that the film is a musical until it's too late and they're sitting in their seat watching the film. So, Steven Spielberg remade West Side Story, and that was unsuccessful. That was a flop. And so I think that dampened people's desire to make musicals. But, just this year, Wicked was incredibly successful in the United States. And the film of Wicked that came out was just the first part of a two-part movie. So the second part is still hasn't been released. And I'm sure that will be as successful as the first part. So, I think they'll try and make musicals, more musicals, but they'll probably be very safe ones like Wicked, based on previously successful Broadway shows or previously well-known intellectual property. So yeah, musicals are still being made, but definitely, in the 1950s, particularly at MGM, particularly, they were putting out tons and tons of them, and they're incredible. Everyone, even the ones that aren't good, are worth seeing. They're just beautiful, lavish movies with great old-fashioned music and incredible dancing, and the Arthur Freed films are all worth seeing. Someone asks, why are franchises like Marvel considered more profitable for Hollywood than original films? And is there a chance for a return of the era of original screenplays? Alicia asks. I think, a lot of it is due to the fact, when I started talking about this, we talked about how, in the 1930s, there was nothing else to watch. There was no television, right? So now not only is there television, but there's everything on the internet. And, there's YouTube and there's Netflix and there's Hulu and, whatever your streaming service of choice is. There are so many other distractions and things that can take away people's attention. It's really hard to get people out of their houses and, going to see a movie. You got to drive to the movie theater and you got to pay for parking and you got to buy popcorn, and it turns into an expensive evening where you could just stay home and watch something incredible on your huge TV set. So, Hollywood is only really going to make things that they feel are sure things, which of course sure things don't exist, but the closest that they can get to a sure thing is a property, intellectual property that people are already familiar with. So if you've seen one Marvel movie, you've seen every Marvel movie. You know what you're in for, and each one is going to be spectacular and have incredible digital special effects and be super loud and super colorful, and so that's the kind of thing that is going to get people out of their houses and into movie theaters. I think, there is a chance for the return of I don't think there's a chance for the return of an era of an original screenplay. But the great thing is people are always making independent movies, and there are always little movies that break through, and that will always happen. And, ironically, you'll see, those films invariably win Academy Awards. And when they do, the studio that distributed them will take credit for the films when they literally had nothing to do with the making of those movies. They bought them when they were finished, and they only distributed and marketed them, which is important. But, the studios are not making interesting independent films. Luckily, some people are. And then, there are anomalous filmmakers like Wes Anderson or Paul Thomas Anderson, who, for whatever reason, get to do whatever they want and have enough of a fan base for them, particularly that if they keep their movies to a certain budget, the movie will break even or make a profit. This summer is going to be a really interesting one because in September, Paul Thomas Anderson's new movie is coming out, and he is kind of a very independent artistic director. And this movie that Warner Brothers made reportedly cost about $250 million, which is like what a superhero movie costs. So I'll be really surprised if that movie makes money, but I will absolutely see it. Someone asks, how do non-standard in a modern sense formats like VistaVision affect the viewing experience? Do you think these formats are still relevant given that so much of the market has shifted towards home viewing? I do, just because, seeing a movie in a theater on a huge screen is a very different experience than, we have great TVs now. We all have huge TVs at home, but it's not the same as being in a room, a dark room with a huge screen that completely takes up your peripheral vision. And also, watching a movie, and I try to do this when I'm home alone. Like, I try to watch a movie from start to finish without stopping in the dark. Like I try to watch a movie at home like I would watch a movie in a theater. And I think most people don't do that. And, that's fine. People should watch however they want to watch. But, when you're at home, you're going to pause and, maybe get something to eat or go to the bathroom. I know a lot of people just are like looking at their phone while the movie is playing. It's a different experience. And then, of course, seeing a film with an audience, to me is, and it makes an incredible difference, especially a comedy, to be in a room where people are laughing. It makes me more prone to laugh, and it just makes you enjoy the movie more, I think. And it's a shame that moviegoing has become such a rare experience. I don't know what it's like in Russia. I assume it's very similar to what it is here, which is people don't go to the theater to see movies very often. Someone asks, what are some of my favorite musicals, classic and contemporary? I talked about La La Land. I was really struck rewatching it. It was much better than I liked it when I saw it in the theater, but it was even better than I remembered it. And when I first saw that movie, I lived in New York City, and I have since moved to Los Angeles. And so seeing that movie is really a love letter to Los Angeles. And it's a beautiful depiction of what it's like to live in Los Angeles. And that was something I really appreciated about it that I did not previously. In terms of classic musicals, I would say to anybody, please watch Singing in the Rain, which was made in 1953 by MGM. directed by Gene Kelly and Stanley Donen, and starring Gene Kelly. It's just an incredibly great movie about, it's a comedy about the shift from silent movies to sound, and just all the problems that studios encountered making that change. And I showed a clip from it when we were talking about Hollywood and technology. But it's just super funny, and the music is incredibly great. And it's Debbie Reynolds' first picture. She was 19 when she made the movie. It's just great. Everything about it is great, and I highly, highly recommend that movie. It's I think the best American musical ever made. Tatiana says, "Thank you, John, for your answer and your lecture. That was a great historical review of the industry." Thank you, Tatiana. I really appreciate it, and thank you for watching. Dasha asks, "How have streaming platforms like Netflix and Disney Plus changed the traditional Hollywood business model?" That's a really good question, because it has made a really significant change, and a lot of people think that it has sort of the switch to streaming has really kind of inspired mediocrity, because now a film, especially the films that are financed by the streaming services, so each studio owns a streaming service, so a lot of content now is made just for streaming. And so for a movie to be released theatrically is a big deal. It means that the studio has higher hopes for it than the average content. I mean, it's going to wind up on the streaming service ultimately, but it means that the studio thinks it can make money, big money, in theaters, and even be eligible for awards. It's still true that a film has to be screened in a theater to be eligible for an Academy Award. So, not all of the films Netflix makes are theatrically released. And if Netflix theatrically releases a movie, which is expensive, you have to market it and distribute it. That's an investment in the film, saying, we think this film could win awards, or we think this film has an even broader popularity than just the streaming model. But the problem with content made for streaming is that you don't need to get people into a theater. A movie that's shown in a theater, people have to decide to go to the theater and pay money to see that movie. Content that's made just for a streaming service, you're at home just flipping through options, and maybe you'll watch something, maybe you won't. And the financial imperative, the business imperative behind those kinds of films is just to keep people subscribing, and it doesn't have to be this like home run Oscar-winning masterpiece, as long as somebody flipping through the front page of their Netflix account sees something that they watch while they're talking to their kids or whatever, so they keep on subscribing. So it's a much lower bar, I think, to making streaming content than making content that is screened for audiences. Alicia asks, "How has the rise of binge watching changed storytelling and episode structure in Hollywood productions?" I'm not sure. It's a hard question for me to answer, because my interest is really primarily in movies, and I guess people might binge watch a movie and its sequels, but to me, binge watching is about series like television. And now the line between television and film is increasingly blurred with the advent of streaming. Obviously, before streaming, they were two very different platforms. And in fact, to me, one of the great ironies, like when I was a kid, there was an incredible difference between acting in movies or working in movies and working in television. And working in movies was seen as exponentially superior to working in television. Movies were an art and television was a business. And with the advent of streaming and the kind of corporatization of movie making, I think now it's generally considered that the best aesthetic product is being made for television. It's being made for streamers, and you have all these movie stars, people like Meryl Streep who are doing streaming, and I think it's more lucrative. It's now seen as better, and movies now are like kind of this weird ghetto because the only movies that get made are superhero picks, and it's the sort of really artistic, interesting new work is not being made by movie studios. So binge watching to me is about devouring an entire series, and it's just weird. I don't, streaming series have the aesthetics of movies. Certainly, you're watching well-made filmed entertainment, but you're watching it at home, which is a different experience. And you're kind of watching it because an algorithm suggested it to you. And I think especially binging, people binge because at the end of one episode, the next episode immediately begins playing, that kind of draws you in. And so I it's hard to binge movies because they're longer. And I remember there was a documentary. There's an incredible documentary about the history of movies that is 15 hours long. And I saw it at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. And it was literally screened over 2 days. So the first day they screened 7 hours of it. And the second day they screened 8 hours of it. And I can remember when it was done, the lights coming up on the second day, and just standing up and looking around and seeing the few people that you had seen the previous day that you knew had seen the whole thing. And we all kind of acknowledged each other, and that's very different, I think, than just being at home and watching 4 episodes of, whatever show you're obsessed with. So I think of binge watching as a TV thing and not a movie thing. Okay, so okay, sorry. Someone asked, Tatiana, what do you think of the film Anora? I was surprised it won the Oscar and even disappointed. I enjoyed Anora, and I especially enjoyed it at its success. It won Best Picture because it and this is kind of a perverse take. It was the least financially successful Best Picture winner in the history of the Oscars. Not a lot of people saw it in theaters. And to me, it was just it was kind of a triumph for non-superhero, non-franchise IP movies. American movies have just been so overtaken by the same things over and over and over. And every movie is about a Marvel superhero, that to see a little movie that goes against the grain win was very heartening to me. And I completely understand you're not liking it. It's I won't say it's a difficult movie, but it's too long. I would say that for sure. And it's a weird, if you like genre movies, that's a strange movie because it's basically like 3 different genres, one after the other. It switches gears a lot, and I think that might make it a hard watch for some people. And I'd be interested. Maybe it's about Russians, and maybe for Russian people, the portrayal of Russians in that movie is not a positive one, and I don't know, but I thought it was well acted, and I love Sean Baker, the guy that wrote and directed that movie. Has made several movies previously that I really enjoyed, and I support him as a figure. he made a movie called Tangerine, which is about transsexual prostitutes in Los Angeles, sex workers. And he shot the movie entirely on iPhones. And if you see this film, it's beautiful. You would have absolutely no idea. And, that doesn't mean it's a great film, but I just, I applaud the guy who made Anora just for what he's doing and just being a figure outside of this huge corporate Hollywood that now exists. And, you have every right to not enjoy Anora. That's the great thing about movies and everything. Like, people like different things. Tanya asks, hello, when did independent cinema appear? Were independent films made during the golden era of Hollywood? Basically, no. Independent cinema, and I think we talked about this maybe last time, until the sort of late 1960s, early 1970s, just the technical equipment you needed to make a film made it virtually impossible for anybody who didn't work for a studio to make a film. And if you see pictures of what cameras and lights and microphones looked like in the 1940s and 1950s, it's like any technology of that time. They're huge, heavy, expensive machines. And it's easy for us to sort of forget that, because now everyone has a movie camera in their pocket. And, people are uploading essentially independent movies to YouTube and Instagram by the millions every day. But, that's all sort of dependent on available technology, and available technology wasn't available until really the late 1960s and early 1970s. And even then, you're talking about big cameras that you'd have to hold on your shoulder, and you'd have to have a separate person recording sound, or you'd have to add the sound after. And there were just technical restraints. But you see it a lot in like John Cassavetes was one of the first directors in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And he just would go out on the streets of New York and shoot films, and his films are incredibly interesting. He was a very successful Hollywood actor, and he kind of took the money he made acting in movies and used that to make movies as a director himself. And he would shoot without permits on the streets of New York, and everything was shot on location. But it's really not until late 60s, early 70s, during the golden age of Hollywood, there were 5 studios making 50 movies a year. And those were the people who made movies. And those were the only people, we just saw in this talk, like, and they're still here. If you drive around Los Angeles, these companies have these huge backlots. I mean, when you drive around and see the studios, they're enormous, and there would be like a New York street, and then a medieval castle, and MGM had a paddle wheel steamboat, and they would just redress them for different movies to make them look like they were in different periods. But it just took incredible amounts of money and space and time. And as we saw during the golden era, Hollywood was making so much money, they were able to build all these incredible facilities to make these movies, and it just kind of snowballed. The sad thing is, when the studio system collapses in the 1970s, the studios start realizing that these enormous backlots that they had were literally more valuable as real estate than they were as places to make films. So most famously here in Los Angeles, there's a big neighborhood here called Century City, which is all these skyscrapers. It's a big real estate development. And Century City literally only exists because the movie Cleopatra, which was made in 1963, it's the movie where Elizabeth Taylor met Richard Burton. Cleopatra was one of the most infamous flops in the history of movies. It was incredibly expensive to make and went hugely over budget and did not succeed financially. And it was such a big flop that the studio that made it, 20th Century Fox, was going to go bankrupt. It literally was bankrupting the studio. And the only way to save the studio was to sell their backlot. You know, the real estate where they made all their films, they sold it to real estate developers, and they built what is now known as Century City because it was part of 20th Century Fox. And so when you drive by Century City, that was the Fox lot. But because of Cleopatra, they had to sell it. Fun fact, if you're ever in Los Angeles, Tatiana says, Hollywood Golden Age movies is romance and dream to Russians. We love them so much. I'm so glad. Me too. There's a kind of hope for the pattern that good will ever conquer evil. The music as well adds, and the actors love this parallel you've made, TV commerce versus movies as art. Thank you so much. And I totally agree with you. You know, one really beautiful thing about Golden Age Hollywood movies is they always have happy endings, you know, which is just beautiful, I think. Can you recommend a good movie related to Hollywood or the film industry? There are a lot, Alicia. Boy, I'm trying, you know, it's weird. I think of Singing in the Rain is really a movie about making movies. It's all about the studios. It's also a musical. But it's great. I'm trying to, there must be some, I'm sorry, you kind of put me on the spot. I mean, La La Land also is kind of a movie about, it's about being in the entertainment industry and making movies. I'm sorry, I'm just having a total mind. I don't know. Next time I'll make a list. I promise. Okay. Tom, thank you for watching. I think we're out of time. And I just want to remind you guys that the next talk, now I forget when it is. I said when, it's on 19 August. And we're going to talk about censorship, which is actually a very interesting topic, I think. So thank you all again for watching. Thank you so much for your questions. I really appreciate them. And we will see you on Tuesday, 19 August. Thanks.